It is my honor now to kind of introduce both Claire and Shariq for today's conversation. And as was highlighted earlier, today is all about, or this panel is all about leadership. And so, my sense is you're in this room because you're a rising star in your organization and continue, and you've been selected to be here. So I think, hopefully this will resonate with you, and there'll be more to come. But let me jump in on our two panelists. So Claire Chino, Executive Vice President, Chief Administrative Officer, Itochu International, Inc. Claire is Executive Officer of Itochu Corporation, a Fortune Global 300 company headquartered in Japan, and Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of Itochu International, a subsidiary of Itochu in New York. Before assuming her position in New York, she was General Counsel of Itochu. In 2013, she became the first female executive officer of any major trading company in Japan. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, sir.
Shariq is Vice President of Global Diversity, and I learned earlier has been at Chevron for 43 years, so that is commendable by itself. He's responsible for Chevron's diversity, inclusion, and ombuds functions, and oversees the company's strategic partnerships with universities and professional societies. So we're going to jump right into the questions because we spoke earlier about some of the traits that we want to touch on today. So I think for the group here, one of the first things that I would want to know is you've both are in very senior roles in your organizations, and maybe Claire, I'll start with you. How did you get here?
Well, I don't know how I got here, actually, but I think before moving from a very flat organization to a hierarchical Japanese company, that was actually a big change. But I think probably one of the things that helped me was the fact that I didn't really mind speaking my mind. So I think in a very hierarchical organization, you tend to think about what others are thinking of you. But having come from a flat organization, I wasn't really used to that hierarchical structure. And I think in the end, not really thinking too much about politics of the organization, but speaking my mind as to what I thought was the right thing, especially in my legal role, helped me, I guess, get to where I am. Since 8 weeks ago, I'm assuming a very new position, so I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. I've done legal for 25 years now. I'm in charge of corporate planning, which is very different from legal. But I hope to, keep up this trait of speaking up my mind and not really worrying too much about the corporate ladder, my boss, my subordinate, whatever.
So Shariq, I'm sure, the only thing I'm sure of is that in 43 years, you haven't just done one thing at Chevron.
That's right.
So maybe you could share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, if I shared all my thoughts, we'd be here all day after 43 years. But just Reader's Digest version, I came to Texas A&M from what is now Bangladesh in 1970 and graduated with a degree in chemical engineering and went to work as a process engineer in our Port Arthur, Texas refinery. And I was a good process engineer, but my passion was marketing. And the way I went into marketing is through planning and working on mergers and acquisitions. So I worked on our acquisition of Getty Oil, our acquisition and merger with Chevron and Caltex Petroleum Corporation. And as I said, a 43-year career, there have been lots of highlights and lots of bumps up and down the road, but the one thing that has been constant is change. I've lived or worked in 17 different jobs in 11 different countries, and my last job was President of Global Marketing, which was overseeing an organization that had $44 billion in revenues and operated under 3 brands, Chevron, Texaco, and Caltex. So that's just sort of the short version of a 43-year career.
Great. Claire, I'm going to start on a question around leadership in a multicultural context. So you led in Japan, you're leading here. Is that different? Is it the same? You talked about speaking your mind. How do you think about that?
I think it is very different in the sense that in Japan, as I said, it's very hierarchical. Also, there is very little mobility. So many of the employees at Itochu Corporation are people who have been there since the age of 22 and actually expect to retire with the company. So it's a very homogeneous company, which is not, unusual for any Japanese company. It's very, I think, typical Japanese. And in that sense, I think you have to really understand the Japanese businessman's psyche. Mm-hmm. And although I did say that, I do speak my mind, I think there are ways that you have to think about how to speak your mind in a setting like that. But I think, thinking about how you present yourself, who your audience is, knowing your audience, it's not necessarily something that is unique to a Japanese company. Now I'm here in the United States, and now we have, of course, Japanese people, but mostly American employees. And communication is very important. We have to think about how to communicate the headquarters strategy to the Itochu International subsidiary employees so they can understand that. And when I say understand that, it's not just about the language, but the way in which you communicate your message. And I think vice versa. I think our voice from the U.S. being heard back at headquarters, that is something that's also very important.
Great. Shariq, global multinational firm, inclusion, diversity, innovation, do those things fit together? How do you guys think of that?
Yes. I came to the realization that the conversation needed to shift from diversity and inclusion is good, and it's the right thing to do, to the fact that it's a business imperative. And oftentimes we've heard this conversation that diversity and inclusion is what big companies do, that there's no cause and effect relationship between firm performance and diversity and inclusion. And in fact, that's not true. Because if you look at the studies that have been done, and the peer-reviewed studies would fill this room, but the most monumental study was done at your alma mater, Cornell, that showed that over a course of 20 years, through the business cycle, in 6 different industries, at 97 different companies, there's a curvilinear relationship between business performance and diversity and inclusion. In fact, if you're below 30%, when you start on a diversity and inclusion journey, your performance actually goes down for various reasons that we can talk about on the Q&A session. But after you go past 30, it actually takes off stratospherically. And so however you measure performance in your business, return on capital employed, return on shareholder equity, return on earnings per barrel, in our case, safety, diversity and inclusion companies, the people that are doing much better than 30%, exponentially do better, about 65% better over the course of the business cycle than those that are less diverse. And so in our company, diversity and inclusion has always been part and parcel of our strategy. It has never been something extra. We have something called the Chevron Way, and the very first pillar of the Chevron Way is diversity and inclusion. And in our performance management system, every employee from our chairman down has a diversity action plan as part of their performance management system, which we call the PMP. And this is how you're judged, because as in all companies, you treasure what you measure. And we measure diversity and inclusion with the same rigor that we measure performance in financial performance, earnings performance, margin performance, or safety performance. And then we hold people accountable. And the reason we do that is because our performance is improved through diversity and inclusion. And why is that? Because the only way you can create sustainable advantage over your competition is to out-innovate them. And diversity and inclusion is the single most important catalyst for innovation than anything else. So it's a business imperative.
If I could just jump in, I think it's so true that it's very much a business case. So when you talk about diversity and inclusion, I think, of course, people start to think about people's rights, this and that. And of course, there's that soft side to it. But I think it's very important to remember that it is a business strategy. Mm-hmm. It is a business case. And of course, stepping aside a little bit from the business things, but for example, Japan has recognized that diversity and inclusion is a national strategy. So it's not just about the soft thing, but it actually translates into numbers.
So I think you're both talking about, as I hear some of the answers, around being adaptable, embracing change. You both have made those changes through your own careers. I think, Claire, you talked earlier about the cultural piece of it in Japan and being here, but spend a little bit of time around leadership on functional change. Because I think you were, certainly you were at a law firm, you were the general counsel, now in a very different role. Is that, what makes that hard, and how are you working through that? I think for those that are in the room, as they move up the corporate ladder in their organizations, that's inevitable.
So I used to tell my younger colleagues to always think outside the box. But when my CEO actually approached me in December last year to say, Claire, you're no longer going to be in legal. We're actually moving you to New York to take on a very different role. I was actually very surprised. And I think the CEO was worried that I would actually quit from the company. I don't know why he thought that. He probably saw me as a legal person who was, capable of doing other things. But the fact is that although I had been telling people to think outside the box, I wasn't really looking at myself in a role other than legal. So it was actually a very interesting call for me that no matter how you see yourself, you should actually think that there is this other you that others may actually see in you. And if that challenge comes to you, you should be able to step up to the plate and at least say, yes, I'll take a chance in trying to achieve whatever is expected of me.
Great. Shariq, I want to stick with that theme for a second, but I want to get your thoughts around, folks in this room are running teams, small teams, big teams, they're part of teams. You've run teams in different large organizations. How important is vision and direction in those contexts? How do you think about that, and how do you deliver that to the folks who are with you or who work for you?
Yeah, I'll talk about vision in a second. And, lots of people have different definitions of what is a vision. So I'll give you mine. My definition of vision is an inspirational and aspirational picture of the desired future state. So it's inspirational because it must engage both hearts and minds. It's aspirational because it has to be out there. It has to be a reach. It's not a slam dunk. It's something that you have to really aspire to and work hard and have systems and processes to get there. But it's not a wish and it's not a hope. And as I said, hope is not a strategy. So you have to have a very systematic approach of what the gap is between your current state and your desired future state and develop a very systematic plan to get there. But, in the course of 43 years, I've learned some lessons. So when I was a young process engineer, basically an individual contributor, I focused a lot on execution, delivering what, and 43 years ago, you were told what to do. It wasn't a negotiation. There was no performance agreement. This is what you're going to do. This is how much you're going to spend to do it. This is how you're going to do it. And this is the time you're going to do it by. And we have actually progressed from that in many companies. But execution was extremely important. Then when you became a general manager, vice president, head of an operating company, or head of a strategic business unit, it was about strategy. Set the vision, define the strategy to get there, develop a plan. And then when you become the head of a large division of a large corporation, which in our case we are, you talk about vision and the aspirational and inspirational picture of the desired future state. But here are some lessons that I've learned along the way. First of all, execution without strategy is mindless. But strategy without execution is a pipe dream. But what trumps it all is culture, because culture eats strategy for lunch every day. So what your organization is about, and in our case it's the Chevron way, and how do you conduct the business and how do you achieve results, and what is achieving results the right way mean in your cultural context, that will be your competitive advantage. So you have to have it all, but clearly you have to have both strategy and execution, but most importantly, you have to have a vision, and that vision has to be driven by a culture.
I'll stay on this strand for a moment, because when Shariq was talking, it reminded me, I was at a conference earlier this week in our business, and we had a guest speaker, so I'm totally borrowing and plagiarizing. This is not mine, but it was Adam Grant, who wrote a recent book with Sheryl Sandberg called Option B, around resilience and tenacity after going through the tragedy that she went through. And he presented, as Shariq was talking about vision, some ideas that were really out of the box around your company. And he said one that I'll just share with the group, because I just thought it was like all of us were kind of sitting back like, wow, which is, I think you're in that session and you're with your colleagues and you say, how are we going to move the company forward? How are we going to save this business? How are we going to do it? And his point is that in good cultures, companies have a lot of agreeable givers and people who give. He's like, so how do you turn that upside down? Because that's a lot of defense, and that promotes groupthink, those ideas, saving and driving. He said, try something different, and this was what really kind of threw us off. He said, come up with the idea, and people need to get comfortable with this. How do we kill the company? And he said, I want you to sit and think of, how do you kill the company? How do you beat us? And actually, when you go through a process like that, that's where you really learn what's the best defense to play and what's the best offense to play and what's the best opportunity. So I remember him saying it, and he uses it even in the context of his reviews and the willingness to be open with his reviews and be harsh. But I thought, gosh, to flip upside down, because we're always talking about how do we move this forward? How do we get better? But if you ask the people who know how everything works to come up with a strategy as to how to dismantle it, you'd be surprised what you'll find. And so anyway, that was a thought. As Shariq was talking about vision, that was something that was very different that jumped out to me. So Claire, I'm going to pivot back to you because I want to talk about, I see you around the room, you're a senior executive, and as I was reading your bio, and a woman, which is so great for a lot of folks to see in this room and frankly in this entire conference, the role you play. There has to be challenges around leadership that are specific to being an executive and a woman in a global Fortune 300 company. I think this is where I'd love for you to share some of that advice because of the path you've been on.
So when I started out my career, as a lawyer, as a litigator. And this was in Newport Beach, California, a beautiful place to be. And I remember, so I was 25, Asian, not very tall, actually very small. And I remember opposing counsel coming up to me. He was much bigger than I am, more experienced, Caucasian, tall. And I was actually sitting outside a court bench room. And he came up, I was sitting down, and he came up, he put his foot on the bench right next to me and just started talking to me from above. And I don't know whether it was because I was young, because I'm Asian, because I'm a woman, because I'm short. I don't know any of that. But I think the point is that we have so many different identities ourselves. I am a woman. I used to be young. I'm not necessarily very tall. All of that. I think that's all part of your diversity, your traits. And you have to remember that. You have to actually embrace all of that. I guess my point is that when people try to label you for who you are, that you're Asian, you're a woman, you have to actually have a good group of friends or community where you can feel comfortable and actually free yourself from the labels that others are trying to place on you. And that's, it sort of goes back to thinking outside the box too. I didn't think I was doing that, but I definitely saw myself as a legal person. But in fact, the CEO actually freed me from that box that I had around me. So it's not necessarily very easy. I think when you're the only woman, let's say, sitting in a boardroom, which in my case is the case, you feel very self-conscious about the fact that you're a woman. But how do you actually go back to your many traits, wonderful traits that you have, so that you can actually be free of that is key.
I'd love for you both to opine on this because I think the buzzword over the last 3 to 5 years has been disruption. And depending on the business, we have people from all different industries here, but their businesses may be getting disrupted. They may be the disruptor. They may be protecting businesses. I mean, there's all different facets around this and how people are leading. But let's talk about leadership in the context of things are moving so quickly. In the traditional sense, motivation, challenging, kind of encouraging folks on your team. How do you influence and motivate your team in challenging times? And how would you say in these times specifically is an effective way to approach that? Shariq, I'll start with you.
Clearly having a set of values is very important. And the Chevron way is something that we use as our guidelines, whether things are going well or things are not going well. So we will always have as one of our pillars diversity and inclusion, whether we're growing or shrinking or staying the same. That's a constant. Values never change. So having the context of what values you operate under, and others include integrity and trust, innovation, protecting people and the environment, and high performance. Those are the things that are our guiding stars. And those are the things that have held us in good stead, whether things are going well or going not so well. And ultimately believing in resilience and getting people to focus on the future and focus on the positive by being very aware of where the disruptors are. In the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen a huge amount of tumult in the oil and gas industry in terms of pricing. And interestingly enough, this has not been caused, as in the past, by geopolitical things. It's actually been caused by technology. The greatest technological revolution that has occurred in the energy space has not been in biomass or electrics. It has been horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And that has absolutely upended the way we think about this industry. But embracing that change and understanding that technology and having a belief in your system and your processes and ultimately your values is how you motivate people.
Claire?
Well, I think in order to motivate people, you have to actually trust them, that they're key players in moving, whatever forward. And I think it has to be, of course, value-driven. It's interesting that, so it's been a while now, but I remember when Sarbanes-Oxley came into effect, there was this huge debate about how to actually improve corporate governance. The U.S. model of having these, really very difficult laws and rules and regulations, or at that time, the European model of actually having not too many rules or laws, but actually, more of a value-driven governance. At the end of the day, I'm not sure which was the right way, but I tend to believe that rather than having these micromanagement style approach, it's better to have the core values be understood and embraced by everybody, and then give the employees and your colleagues the power to run with that. But because, by entrusting leadership in the people that you work with, actually motivates them. And I think, in return, I am very motivated by that.
I'd like to now share a little bit of insight, hoping the two of you can, around how you were led and someone who had a profound influence on you. So maybe, Claire, I'll start with you this time. I'd love to hear one example of someone who really inspired you in a way, through leadership, through advocacy, some way that was, that you still remember. It could have happened 2 days ago or, at the beginning of your career.
So I'm almost embarrassed to say this because it sounds so very Asian, but certainly my role model and my leader has always been my mother. She's somebody who started her career. She was a trailing spouse for many, many years. But when she reached 50, she decided to enroll herself in a PhD program. And she finished her PhD, and her career started really at the age of 55. And from 55 to 70, she worked. And I think that tells me, especially being in a corporation, that your career is not necessarily about, working for whatever company, starting, at the age of 22 and going up the corporate ladder. You really have to think about, what career choice you have in any given moment. And, going back again to the Japanese model of thinking that your career equals which company you work for how many years, what your title is with that particular organization. I think that is just too limiting. I think it limits yourself. So certainly my mother has been a motivation. I also think that I was actually watching this great interview with James Levine, the Metropolitan Opera conductor. He is a great leader in the sense that he is committed to what he's doing. He's very sympathetic, and he encourages musicians to bring forward all the best that they have. So he's somebody that I don't know personally yet, but is a great leader in putting together such a great orchestra.
Thanks for that. Shariq?
Yeah, there were actually two seminal moments that shaped me. One in 1975 and the other in 2008. And the one in 1975 was when I graduated in chemical engineering from Texas A&M and was posted as a process engineer to then Texaco's Port Arthur, Texas refinery. And if you think about 1975, there was just 11 years after integration of the South. And there were a few African American operating heads. So if you think of a refinery, there are processing units, and each processing unit, particularly in a union plant, is headed up by an operating supervisor. And I was assigned as the engineer, and I was the only Asian in the entire refinery, and the only foreign-born. And Port Arthur, Texas, just to give you a little context, was a wonderful place, but also happened to be 15 miles from a place called Vidor, Texas. And Vidor, Texas was the national headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. And so I come into this organization, and, everyone there at Port Arthur is right on the border of Louisiana and Texas, was Cajun or Creole, and had never left the area. And I wanted to relate to my union colleagues. And the person that taught me how to do that is a gentleman who had struggled through Jim Crow and through segregation, and now was the boss. All his underlings were white Caucasian males from Louisiana. And his name was Mr. Forrest, Mr. Shelton Forrest. And I learned a lot from him, even though he only had a high school education, about how to deal with people that are different from you, and how to motivate people, and how to see that in the viewpoint from the outside, which I brought, would uplift all of us. In 2008, when I was president of global marketing of Chevron, I had the opportunity to spend about an hour and a half with Madiba, Nelson Mandela. And the next day, I was going to address our entire team in Cape Town. And I said, Madiba, I'm going to talk to 600 of my colleagues next day. They're going to be astonished that we had 90 minutes together, but I'd love to take a message from you to them. What would it be? And he said, well, tell them to get an education. And you might find this surprising, because I know everybody that you've hired has an education. But I don't mean a college education. What I mean is an education that allows you to walk in another person's shoes and sees another viewpoint. Because without that kind of education, you lack the moral compass to lead. And the reason I remember all those words is that had a very profound impact. As other people, we then got Union Oil of California that we purchased, and of course Texaco before that. The assimilation of all these cultures and understanding the viewpoint that everyone brings has been a watchword of how I have attempted to lead.
Thank you both for sharing that. It's great. All right, I'd like to now, I think this is something actually we do at our firm, and we actually post it on the intranet site, and there's always like very interesting responses. I think people get a lot out of it. So, and I'm guessing you've been asked this question before, but I'm going to ask it. And Shariq, I'm going to start with you this time. What would your current self today tell your younger self, knowing what you know now, if given the opportunity?
Yeah, just don't judge a book by its cover. So, it's very nice that you've got a PhD from Cornell or Berkeley, but understand the value that someone brings that maybe not has a totally different background from yourself. Don't assume, for example, that accents translate into intelligence, which sometimes we tend to do, and that's very relevant in the Asian context. Don't assume anything, listen first. I would tell you that I was not much different than somebody that just come out of college and gone into an environment where most of the people did not have a college education in a refinery and assume you knew more. Probably the latter assumption of, yes, you know less, but maybe what you can do is take all this institutional knowledge and use your education to systemize it and take people through the soft skills to where they need to go. So in summary, I would say I have learned that soft skills are harder than the so-called hard skills of subject matter expertise. But 85% of all decisions to promote people in corporate America are based on soft skills. So emphasize those early in your career would be something that I would tell my young self.
Thank you.
Well, I think relax and let go. I think it's, I don't know. I mean, I think when you're young, you're trying to, prove yourself. You're trying to do all these things by yourself, and maybe asking for help may look like a weakness. Of course, I tended to try to do everything myself. But looking back, sometimes it's always good to, approach people and ask for help. And maybe I can say that 25 years later. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very difficult question because early on you have to really prove yourself. And if you're asking for help all the time, that's not going to get you anywhere. But I think there has to be this right balance of maybe asking for help, not trying to do everything yourself, and in that process, looking for a mentor and sponsor. I definitely found a great sponsor and I think that's the reason that I'm here. He's the one who helped me really teach me a lot of things. So by reaching out and looking for somebody who would support you.
Yeah, I think that point is one that certainly really resonates with those of us at Goldman Sachs. I think I may have shared this, but the network, the Asian Professional Network's theme for 2 years was mentorship and sponsorship. And a lot of that was, frankly, education. Those are very clearly different things, actually, which I know the three of us are very, very clear on. But I would say, and I think probably everyone here is clear on, but just something really important to know that being mentored is being provided guidance, someone taking that time to support you in a way that you ordinarily would not get from your manager or some other place. And sometimes it is your manager, but sometimes it's a level above or another business. Sponsorship is something that you earn and comes with a different type of support as someone who's actually using their own sweat equity, their own stature, their own place in the organization to help lift you up. And you've earned that right with that person based on the quality of your work, based on what you've executed on. And so I do think that's such a big part and certainly a thread of Asian professionals and Asian Americans and having that support. And we've pivoted, and actually this is actually a good segue to the next question, which is, so how do you play that role? How do you play that role for others in your organization? So we've talked a lot up to this point around the leadership traits and what has worked for both Shariq and Claire, but where I'd like to pivot to and spend a little bit of time on, and Shariq, I'll start with you, is how do you advocate for others? How do you empower other Asian talent, Asian American talent at your organizations, which all these folks in this room can do?
Yes, we're a very process-driven company, so utilizing your infrastructure as a leader to promote in a systematic way the development and access to your diverse talent is very important. So I'll tell you a story. In 2003, I became president of Chevron Global Marketing. And we had a regional vice president in all of the continents, Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa. And as I looked at my leadership team and their leadership teams, it became very obvious that they were made up of white males, whether they were from South Africa, the UK, Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand, but very few people that looked like our customers. And so we had a process that selection teams had to have diverse members on them, and slates had to have diversity on them. And we observed a very interesting phenomenon that diverse candidates, Asian, African, Latin American, were on long lists, they were on short lists, but when the actual candidate was selected, the diversity went down. So rather than say that Joe was not as good as other candidates, we very systematically outlined what was handicapping Joe from this assignment. And let's say it was lack of P&L experience. So I had 11 members of my leadership team. We created a database of 65 such candidates that had a gap. And in 3 years, we had a plan to fill that gap. And the diversity of this team of leaders and their leaders went from 0%, as defined by non-Caucasian males and females of any race, to 75%. because that was tied to compensation. And it was a method of sponsorship, but it was a very systematic, planned method that utilized our culture and our processes, that if someone had a gap, there is a strategy and a plan that has to occur that somebody has the responsibility for to fill that gap. So that was one way to do it. And obviously, informal sponsorship, I recognized talent and playing it forward, because I did not get, Claire is absolutely right, to where I was without a helping hand and a hand up from many people of all races. Not just advice, but actual advocacy. But as Phillip said, mentorship, we have 300 mentor pairs that our employee networks actually handle. They're peer-to-peer, upward mentorship, but sponsorship is something that you earn through your performance. And the ability to connect with a sponsor and ask for help once you have been identified as someone that is deserving of that sponsorship through your performance is the strategy that all of us can use. Claire?
So I want to share a story about MIT and their Department of Chemistry. Several years ago, they were wondering why there were so few women in the Department of Chemistry at MIT. And they realized that even when there was an opening at MIT, fewer women were applying. Not because, they were not qualified, but I guess they felt that they were not themselves necessarily qualified to apply for that position. So they started this program where they would actively go out and encourage women to apply for that position. And of course, by applying doesn't mean that they would necessarily get the position, but at least, get to the door and knock on the door. You might be let in, you might not be. So I think being a sponsor, especially for me, means that if I see people who are very capable, encouraging them to take the next step, because I'm sure that they can get to the next step. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is, for those of us who are sponsoring, it would be much easier if the ones who want to be sponsored are more forthcoming. So I tell my young colleagues to, of course, always keep in touch with their prior sponsors, their present sponsors. Don't be shy about telling your successes, because those people who are more forefront in my mind are the ones that I tend to sponsor more easily. So.
If I could just add
Please.
one thing, Claire talked about James Levine, the conductor of the Met. One of the most interesting experiments that was done in the arts was trying to understand the phenomenon of why there weren't more women in orchestras. And if you look at the period between 1979 and 2009, the leading conservatories of music, particularly in the string section, whether it's Juilliard or San Francisco or Cincinnati, were 50% female. But the big five orchestras were not. They continued to be 99 to 95% male. So they tried an experiment where they went from open auditions, where you would come out on the stage, play, the judges would be in the second row, you would be judged, and you would be selected. They went from that to closing the draperies and having everybody take off their shoes, so you couldn't tell if somebody was in heels or not. Within 10 years, the big five went to 50% female. Those were the only two variables that changed. And it became very obvious, though, while there are many factors that prevent people of color and women, and particularly Asians, from getting to the corner suite, the most important one, in my opinion, is unconscious bias. And unconscious bias training is extremely important, because unlike some diversity and inclusion training where the jury's out whether it works, if you're aware of your biases, you can overcome them. And putting systems and processes to make leadership teams and selection teams aware of their unconscious bias is, to me, the next frontier that we as leaders must embark on.
I completely agree with Shariq. So I took this test thinking that I would have no bias against women, being a woman myself. I was so surprised to see how against women I was. There was this unconscious bias that I somehow developed against women. So it's a good way to learn yourself too.
Yeah, I think we're all, I'm feeling the same way. I would say unconscious bias. We do a program called Voices from Asia, and it's, I think for me, frustrating because you want the process to move faster, but it's not going to, I don't think. But we certainly are intent and committed to bring that type of training in front of people, because I don't think people are looking to deny or ignore it. I just think it's the lack of comprehension and self-awareness, and it's just, but it's one session at a time. It's one unconscious bias kind of review, but it's really powerful. And I think the example you gave is better than anything. That's more lucid than anything else. I mean, that's just the perfect example of how profound that can be. I'm just going to ask a few more questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. And I'm hopeful and looking forward to this group asking a bunch of questions of the panelists. But I'd like to pivot to harder times. So we've all, certainly me included, many times have had real challenges in our career where things just didn't seem as sunny. There wasn't as much momentum. It felt really challenging. As a leader, what traits helped you overcome that? And maybe you can share, I'm happy to share too some of the things that were challenging for me personally. But, what are the things, and as we all know, it never ends, by the way. There's always something. But, maybe you can share a little bit about what those challenges are and how to get through them. So, Claire, I'll start with you, and then we'll move to Shariq.
So I think one of the biggest challenges that I remember is when I received the 360-degree results back. So it was my boss, my colleagues, my subordinates all evaluating me. And I thought I would actually come out really, really very well. And in fact, the scores were actually pretty bad. And that was a big surprise to me. And reading through the comments, I realized that when I was trying to be helpful, so I think I used to say, if somebody was looking very busy, my initial reaction would be, can I help you? Can I help you get through this project or whatever? I found out that through the results that they actually did not appreciate that. They actually saw that as my taking that project away from that person. And so that was actually a big shock. And coming back to this, letting go theme once again, I think I realized that I was a bit of a control freak, that I wasn't necessarily trusting people, although in terms of appearance, I seemed friendly and collegial and all of that. But deep down, maybe I wasn't necessarily working in that way. So to trust more people. And for a year, I worked on that. I consciously stayed away from their projects and tried to let them lead those projects.
I'm going to ask you another question. So how did you stay away? It must have felt unnatural.
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard for them to tell you to back off, right?
Yeah.
So I would actually lock myself away from whatever they were doing.
Okay.
And maybe check back once in a while.
Thanks, Claire. Sure.
I think all of us have been through plateaus or dips in our career, particularly in a 43-year career, but resilience, persistence, belief in yourself, those might sound like cliches, but that's extremely important. The notion of if one door slams, another door opens is also very important. And, some of my friends from China used to say, Chairman Mao used to say, it's always dark before it gets completely black. But my philosophy is actually the opposite, that there's always light at the end of the tunnel. And no, it's not an oncoming train. And there always is, because if you think of things as when they're bad, they're not really that bad. And if you think of things as good, they're not really that good. And, while that prevents the euphoria of a high, it also prevents the depression of a low. So understanding what got you there, having faith. And sometimes all of us have landed in jobs that we didn't like. And the best way to get out of the job is to do very well at it and be recognized. So those are the traits that have held me, at least, in good stead.
Two thoughts here that I wanted to share with the group. The first is going back to what the question before this one, which is, I think a lot of you are here because you're being sponsored by the company that you work for. It's not like everyone can come to this conference. So I would say, for those of you who are here or rising in your organization, don't waste the opportunity to not network with each other, spend time together, catch up with each other. For those who are based here, based elsewhere, abroad. And I'll just share an anecdote. Like, I was on a panel last year with Mahendra, who's here, who runs a big part of General Electric's aviation business. And we couldn't have been happier to see each other. There's just so much like positive energy, and that's what you get out of these relationships. And honestly, a lot of times that person can serve some part, be helpful to you in a way that you can't get within your own organization. So I see a lot of people here who are focused, and it's great, but like, take the time to spend some time with each other. I'm going to deliberately let you guys out probably 10 minutes early because I think you should do that stuff. Don't waste it. I mean, it's just hugely helpful. And that stuff really comes around. The more you work, you wouldn't be surprised how you'll reconnect with folks. The world's smaller than you think. So that's the first thing I want to share. And then on the challenging, I raised my hand on the control freak thing that Claire said, because I'm part of that club. But I got a very good piece of advice recently on it. So where I really have suffered in my career and where I've made adjustments which have modestly improved and working towards more improvement is I wasn't self-aware enough around how my nonverbals were so clearly driving what I really thought and what I really wanted to happen. And so I may have been saying something, but people could read from they could tell when I was stressed out, they could tell when I was deflecting. Those things, I wasn't leading by managing those things and the team. And so someone gave me a piece of advice recently that I really at first didn't make a lot of sense, but now does, and it's worked, which is, she said to me, do the opposite of what your intuition tells you you're going to do. And that actually is quite humbling. It's kind of like, oh man, do I totally have the wrong intuition? This is my first reaction to do the wrong thing. But actually, what really happens is you won't do the opposite. There is so rarely exactly a binary outcome. Like, if you want to do this, there's only one other path. What it actually causes you to do is something different, and something usually a bit more thoughtful, and something a bit more relatable. So I first said, well, the opposite. That means all my intuition is the wrong intuition. But actually, you step back and you say, well, if I think the opposite is this, it ends up being something very different. It's not these two ends. It ends up being kind of over here on the plane or somewhere else. And it's been helpful. And I think I'm like, some of these people, I can tell they like me a little better than they did 18 months ago. But it really, at the end of the day, you cannot lead without people who really trust and are committed to you, and you have followership. And so it was something I couldn't ignore. And I think that's a bit of what you've heard here.